All right, let's continue. The Lightning Network is similar to how banks don't move actual cash between each other, but rather settle their ledgers once a month or quarterly. That's the basic idea behind it. Let's say A and B lock up some Bitcoin between them. Once locked, they update their balances off-chain instead of broadcasting every transaction to the blockchain. From the blockchain's perspective, it simply sees 5 BTC sitting in a single wallet, but within that wallet, A and B freely transact with each other, so the off-chain ledger is constantly being updated. Fundamentally, the Lightning Network is designed for situations where A and B transact frequently, especially for small repeated payments, recording every transaction on-chain. By on-chain, I mean publishing the transaction to the Bitcoin blockchain itself, instead of doing that every time. They can just trade freely within a set time frame. This way, there are no transaction fees. They can exchange value back and forth without fees, until they decide they no longer need the channel. Whenever it's more useful to them, they can withdraw the Bitcoin to use elsewhere, by settling the Lightning channel, either unilaterally or by mutual agreement. That's when the final on-chain transaction is made. Let's say at the start A had 5 BTC and B had none. At the point of settlement, after thousands of microtransactions between them, B ends up with 3 BTC and A with 2 BTC, according to the final ledger. So the Bitcoin gets split 2 to 3 accordingly. If the Lightning Network weren't used, A and B would have to pay fees every single time they transacted, potentially hundreds of times. Assume a $10 fee per transaction. That's a huge amount paid to Bitcoin miners just for processing. But if they open a shared account between them and let all trades settle within that space, they avoid paying fees on every individual transaction. They pay a fee only when creating the wallet, and again when closing or settling the wallet. So with just 2 fees, they can record hundreds of off-chain trades. That's how the system works. When A and B first create a channel, there is an initial requirement for mutual trust, but the system itself is designed to solve that trust problem. So after setup, no further trust is required between them. However, one issue must be addressed. What ensures that the Lightning Network can continue to operate fairly between the two? The answer lies here. Let's say initially A starts with 5 BTC and gradually transfers small amounts to B. A keeps making transactions to make payments. Eventually, A holds 2 BTC and B holds 3. But what if A doesn't settle on chain at 2 to 3, but uses an old ledger? Not the current one, but one from much earlier? Like when A had 5 and B had 0 or 4 and 1. What if A broadcasts that instead? Then B would get cheated, even after providing services all along, and legitimately holding 3 BTC while A holds 2. The blockchain would falsely record A with 4 and B with only 1 nil, and that record becomes permanent. So how can we prevent this kind of abuse? To prevent it, we use a mechanism called a time lock. What is a time lock? It means that A cannot act within a certain time frame. If A tries to settle on chain, they get locked in time, while A is locked during that locked period. B can take action. So the one initiating the on-chain settlement ends up waiting longer. They're trapped in a sort of time prison for a longer duration. B can then present a more up-to-date ledger, which is bound by a shorter time lock. It too is locked for a time, but it unlocks sooner because it's bound by less time. B doesn't get cheated by A. In fact, A can be penalized. Put simply, if you go on-chain, you have to do it with a built-in handicap or penalty. From your opponent's point of view, that's an opening for retaliation. In essence, you're giving them the right to strike back by going on-chain. Why is it set up this way? Because there's an algorithmic rule underneath all of this. When A and B are updating the ledger off-chain, they're essentially using each other's cryptographic keys to facilitate trustless updates. So the person holding the most recent ledger also holds the other party's key, specifically the key for the most recent transaction. So if A tries to act maliciously, since B has A's key, B can claim A's funds as a penalty, while A is locked in a time lock. Bitcoin is built on cryptographic systems that were already developed by cryptographers. It cleverly applies these existing cryptographic tools. In cryptography, I hold a private key and can share it with others. I can transmit it directly, or I can wrap it in cryptographic packaging and send it that way. Now, once it's wrapped, if I take a certain action, the recipient can unwrap that and recover the key. That's the basic idea. These kinds of mechanisms, they're rooted in cryptography, not unique to Bitcoin, and you can apply them effectively. The thing is, if A tries to cheat B, A is automatically caught in a time lock, which gives B the opportunity to punish A. That's the basic idea. It should be clear by now that the Lightning Network incurs almost no fees. I assume there's no disagreement here. As long as neither party can cheat the other, and as long as transactions are frequent between them, they can simply keep updating the ledger off-chain. Then they finalize and settle the channel on-chain, only when they part ways or when they use the Bitcoin elsewhere. So what's the issue? The Lightning Network was first proposed in 2015. That's when the idea of the Lightning Network emerged. Not long after that, it started becoming a hot topic in the crypto world, so I began reading the original papers and studied about it. Naturally, a wave of interesting counterarguments followed. The first and second major criticisms were these. Mathematically speaking, it's unrealistic for everyone to establish one-to-one payment channels with each other. And in order to even set those relationships up, you'd have to lock up Bitcoin in each channel. So how much Bitcoin would you need to lock across all those channels? If you lock Bitcoins across multiple connections, you can't actually use them freely. It's like placing a stake or escrow each time. So naturally, a new line of thinking began to emerge. What if this didn't just apply to direct connections, but also worked between people who don't have a direct channel? Say A and B don't have a direct payment channel, but A is connected to C, and C is connected to B. Then A can send a Lightning transaction to B through C. This type of logic begins to appear in formal research papers, accompanied by counterarguments, and from there the system evolves. By now you all understand that between A and B, they don't need to settle every update on-chain. They keep updating off-chain and only finalize occasionally. I believe that part makes sense to everyone. Now if A and B are not directly connected, how can they transact through an intermediary like C? Advanced cryptographic techniques make it possible. If you look it up, you'll find something called a hash time lock contract, HTLC, which is essentially a type of smart contract. Suppose A and B don't have a direct channel between them, and A wants to send money to B. Let's say A wants to send 1 BTC. A has a Lightning channel open with C, and C has a Lightning channel with B. But A and B don't have a direct Lightning connection. So how does the payment get made? Here's the deal. Outside the blockchain, A and B might first negotiate via phone or email. So A says this to B, since you're about to receive Bitcoin from me, I'll go ahead and send it. But you need to give me a cryptographic key wrapped up so I can't open it. So B takes a key, wraps it cryptographically, and sends it to A. What B actually gives is a hash of the key, a cryptographic envelope. A has no idea what's inside the package. It does contain a key, but it's fully encrypted when it reaches A. I can't unwrap or decrypt it. Let's assume for now that it's completely unbreakable. Of course, this isn't physical packaging, it's metaphorical. Again, A can't open the package alone. But A knows for sure that a valid key is inside the encrypted envelope. So A uses this hashed key to create a conditional smart contract. And remember, A has an existing Lightning channel with C. So A creates a contract and tosses it to C, embedding 1 Bitcoin into it. It's a contract combining the wrapped key and the 1 Bitcoin. Hands this contract over to C. The condition is, go get this key. If you can obtain and use this key, you get the 1 Bitcoin. So how does C earn that 1 Bitcoin? C needs to go to B and retrieve the key. Then C makes B an offer. What does he say? If you give me the key, I'll give you 1 BTC. But remember, B is the one who originally created the encrypted key. So B is the only one who can unlock it. B unwraps the package and hands over the real key to CC, then gives B the 1 Bitcoin as promised. But wait, C doesn't actually have the money, right? He just paid it forward. So now he needs to go back to A to get reimbursed. Now that C holds the key, C presents the key to A. Since A now has the key, they can simply unlock the contract and withdraw the 1 BTC from the smart contract C sent. Now, why would C go through all this effort? It's not out of generosity. It's because of the fee incentive actually locks 1, 1 Bitcoin into the contract with C. And A says to C, I'm giving you access to 1.1 BTC if you fulfill this contract. Then C passes 1 BTC along to B, which means C keeps the 0.1 BTC as a transaction fee. But if the fees were actually this high, there'd be little point in using the Lightning Network at all. In practice, the amounts sent from A to B are usually tiny, measured in sats, and the fee that C earns would also be very small. But for the sake of illustration, I'm using round numbers like 1 BTC and 1.1 BTC to make it easier to understand. So even if A and B don't have a direct payment channel, the transaction can still flow through C. How is that possible? It's because the key is cryptographically wrapped and passed forward. Only the person who has the correct key can unwrap the package. Each contract is built around this wrapped key, and only the original key holder can open it, creating a chain where each step unlocks the next and transfers value. All of this needs to be atomic. In the cryptosphere, atomic means transaction atomicity. It either happens entirely or not at all. Let's say A initiates the transaction with C and locks the funds using a smart contract. If A could just take it back freely, then B would have no reason to trust A. That's why A also can't retrieve the funds at will. It's locked by the rules of atomicity. So if B doesn't reveal the key within the time limit, the funds automatically revert back to A, and the same logic applies when C needs to respond to A. Now, the transaction is time locked. So which time lock should expire first? Since A is the ultimate source of funds, the time lock between A and C should be the longest. Meanwhile, the lock between C and B should be shorter than that. So, by configuring time locks this way, if no one takes any action, say C is lazy and does nothing, then from A's point of view, the one BTC-A locked in the smart contract automatically returns to A if C fails to act. That way, the transaction safely fails if no one follows through. So what does atomic mean in this context? Imagine a chain of smart contracts all linked together. If only part of it executes while the rest fails, someone takes a loss. If one fails, they all fail. And if it succeeds, everything has to succeed. That's why we call it atomic. It can't be split apart. Even though there are separate microcontracts within it, when the system is triggered, it must either fail entirely or succeed entirely. All or nothing. Partial success would be a disaster. That's why we call it atomic, indivisible by design. This whole process must preserve atomicity. Only then can A safely design a smart contract and present it to C. And C knows that as long as they complete their part on time. A can't back out because the funds are locked in the contract. So C can trust the contract and confidently approach B. B, in turn, knows that if they provide the key within the time limit, they'll get paid. And C can then use that same key to claim funds from A. That's how the entire flow works. This mechanism is called multi-hop. This doesn't stop at C. It can hop through D, E, F, and so on, until the payment ultimately reaches its destination. Of course, there are critiques of this model. To summarize it briefly, the network still tends toward centralization. Because people's economic conditions vary widely, only some can afford to create channels with many users. The ones who can lock up enough Bitcoin to open many channels become the trust hubs of the network. Those with limited Bitcoin can only open a few channels, if any, so routes through them are rare. They're like side roads, like highways, main roads, and back roads. The network of trust forms unevenly, structured around economic power. Everything is connected, but not equally. There's economic inequality, because not everyone has enough Bitcoin to lock into channels. Then came the Taproot upgrade, which introduced Schnorr signatures. Let me briefly explain what that means. Previously, we couldn't use Schnorr signatures to compress or aggregate smart contracts. Before we could compress these contracts, here's what would happen. In a multi-hop payment, each intermediary would receive and pass along the exact same information. So what's the issue with that? It opens up the possibility of a small-scale attack in the middle. Not a major attack. A, the sender, and B, the final recipient don't suffer any loss, even if the attack occurs. But those in the middle receive and propagate flawed or misleading information, causing delays in wealth, or even temporarily locking up their funds unnecessarily. This is when everyone sees all the information. To prevent that, each time the information passes through a hop, a function is applied so that the intermediaries can't tell where the funds are ultimately going. They also don't know how much is being transferred. Yes, this is actually possible. It only requires a small adjustment to the data at each hop. Explaining that fully would go beyond today's scope, but you can look up more about it if you're curious. Thanks to Taproot, Schnorr signatures are now possible, improving security significantly. When you route through multiple hops, say from A to B via C, D, E, and F, each of those nodes receives different information. It's functionally the same message, but it's obfuscated differently at each step. It's like a puzzle piece that only fits one way. Each intermediary handles data without knowing how two pieces of information are linked. They simply extract the key they receive, and pass the transaction along while leaving the original data intact. The purpose of this? To ensure that no intermediary knows how much money is moving. They just relay the information blindly, as long as it's within the range of funds they have locked in the channel. In this structure, notice that C pays B first, even though C isn't the sender or final recipient. So C must have enough funds in their wallet to forward the payment. That's why the Lightning Network, when finding a route up, must identify paths where sufficient deposits exist. It must optimize for both availability and efficiency in routing, but no one along the path knows who's sending how much to whom. The funds move only if the function matches, no questions asked. Because the function can be made more complex, intermediaries in the middle simply act as blind relays. And for doing that, they earn a small fee. These fees are finely calibrated and everything is seamlessly connected. As the network becomes more interconnected, it also becomes more stable, and its security continues to improve. At one time, while it is no longer the case, Samsung's Galaxy devices had the largest share of global smartphone market. Each one of these smartphones has the potential to act as a bank, and I've often said you need to recognize that potential. When I talk about Galaxy smartphones, I can't help but name Samsung Electronics, since they're behind it all. Since 2015, I've been studying smart contracts and reading academic papers on the Lightning Network. Samsung kept coming to mind. Why? Well, let me invite you to think about this. People lock up Bitcoin to create payment channels within the network. So who ends up having the most channels? It's those who can afford to open channels with many others. They inevitably become the ones with the most connections. So what does that make them? This isn't supposed to be a centralized system. The whole idea is to promote decentralization. Yet, ironically, Due to economic inequality and disparities in trust, hubs naturally emerge in the network. Here's how you can eventually interpret it. When you look at the Lightning Network topology, it will consist of a few large central hubs dominating the flow of transactions. These hubs, even if they're not centralized by design, even if centralization was never the intention, they still form naturally around economic gravity. When the network searches for the optimal route, it tends to follow the path with the most liquidity, the node with the most connections, and the deepest liquidity. Could that not be Samsung smartphones? That's what I started to believe as I studied the Lightning Network. Why? Let's say I'm a tribal leader in Africa, holding a Samsung Galaxy smartphone. Just assume I'm that leader. This Galaxy phone belongs to me, but Samsung is backing it from the infrastructure side. I lock 1 Bitcoin, and Samsung locks another 1 Bitcoin. 2 BTC are now tied to this smartphone as liquidity. Countless microtransactions can now flow between me and the network through this phone. This Lightning Network channel is just one example. Imagine Samsung Galaxy devices having similar connections all over the world. When I want to transact with someone in South America, a micropayment to someone I don't even know. If we're both connected to Samsung, the payment could be routed in just 2 hops. As long as ledgers are synchronized on each end, the transaction can go through with minimal fees. Even with a total stranger halfway across the globe, I can send them micropayments effortlessly. So what does this mean for Samsung? If Samsung locks up $1 billion worth of Bitcoin, that becomes a matching fund. Yes, the balances shift dynamically with usage, but mathematically speaking, that $1 billion gets matched by $1 billion in user-side Bitcoin liquidity. Now the question is, can Samsung actually leverage that? That's an entirely separate matter. Banks could easily leverage this kind of setup by locking up only 10% of the actual capital and creating credit with the remaining 90%. But the blockchain-based system isn't quite that flexible. Still, with cryptographic protocols and blockchain locking mechanisms, there's still potential to generate derivatives from those locked assets. So conceptually speaking, if you lock up $2 billion worth of assets, you could issue derivative tokens on top of that. Of course, there are regulatory hurdles, but that's a separate issue. The key point is the possibility does exist. That's what makes blockchain powerful, even in a trustless environment. It enables trustless cooperation and settlement. And the intermediary enabling that could be a hardware giant like Samsung with mobile devices. Whenever I explain it like this, someone inevitably says, it's not about the hardware, but rather about platforms like Google. They say the real power lies with whoever controls the most apps. Okay, fair point. That may be true. But at a certain point, you'll need connectivity, not just with smartphones, but even with basic 2G phones. That's where companies like Google start to fall short. Telecom or electronics companies, however, can still stake deposits, even at that low-tech level. Of course, there's the question. Can they stake more value than the phone itself is worth? That's a technical challenge, but it's solvable. Sure, telecom providers vary by region, but Samsung Galaxy is a brand that's distributed globally. The node with the most one-to-one channels will eventually become the optimal route, the hub for the most efficient path. And through Samsung phones, countless Lightning Network transactions could eventually flow, even though the Lightning Network aims for decentralization. In the end, usability drives it toward natural centralization. That was the conclusion I reached after studying related papers in 2016 and 2017. I thought, if only Samsung had realized this earlier. That's why I even proposed a Bitcoin hard fork at the time. I think this is a good point to conclude the explanation of the Lightning Network. I'm not sure if this video covered everything clearly, but I hope you've grasped the key issues. The important takeaway is that the Lightning Network ecosystem continues to evolve, regardless of Bitcoin's price. Adoption of Bitcoin is steadily expanding in scope, and the infrastructure to support Bitcoin's hallmark, finality of settlement, is improving significantly. That's the big picture. You might not get all of this just by reading my book. You need to learn how cryptographic systems work first, like wrapping a key, and tossing it forward when a hashed value is passed along. One party knows the actual key, and the other doesn't know the key, but does know the hash. Using that, they can build contracts at will, and the one holding the key unlocks things step by step. So even without trust, capital can move securely between parties. This is possible because, not only thanks to hashing, but also because we can lock things in time. By locking things to a time condition, you preserve transaction atomicity and prevent partial success. The transaction either fully succeeds or fully fails, and failure isn't a bad outcome. If the initial payment fails, the money just comes back to you. And if they couldn't complete payment on their end, it simply means you don't provide the service, no loss incurred. The real problem is when the service is delivered, but the payment doesn't go through, or when the payment is made, but the service never arrives. These are examples of partial execution, where only one side fulfills their obligation. That's why the ability to time lock transactions is crucial. It allows the transaction to be treated as a single bundle. Either it fails completely, or it succeeds entirely. And because of cryptographic hashing, only the person with the correct key can unwrap the encrypted package, and transactions can be built around these cryptographic envelopes, which allows funds to hop across multiple nodes seamlessly. But does this really result in a fully decentralized network? Not entirely. That's why I brought up the example of Samsung. Still, does it become centralized like Visa or MasterCard? No, it does not. The Lightning Network ecosystems in the future will require serious philosophical reflection and will ignite countless debates which we don't know. Even though this system will be fundamentally different from centralized giants like Visa and MasterCard, it won't be the perfect, fully decentralized utopia that idealists envision. After all, wealth disparities still exist. It's fascinating. The notion that Bitcoin is useless because it handles few transactions needs to be abandoned. Only a couple of years ago, many people doubted the Lightning Network would ever work, but it has steadily taken root, and it continues to grow. It's clear. The Lightning Network is not going to fail. The ecosystem is expanding rapidly, so you should absolutely be paying attention. I keep getting questions about the travel rule. I've even addressed it on several other platforms, on other media, but I can't predict how the travel rule will be applied, specifically in Korea, because it's going to evolve a lot in real-world implementation. In trying to enforce it, there will inevitably be a lot of trial and error, so I can't make definitive claims about it. But here's what I did say. Governments can act. What can a government do? They can pressure exchanges to block transfers to private wallets. They might require special authorization, so that users can only send funds to pre-approved, verified private wallets. That is within a government's regulatory authority. States have the power to play that card. Just because they're not doing it now doesn't mean they won't in the future. And just because they are now doesn't mean they'll do so indefinitely. So what should you really be asking yourself? Is the travel rule actually a critical threat? Let's look at it from another angle. The government typically implements the travel rule, ostensibly to prevent money laundering. In fact, it could be a way to map out who owns how much Bitcoin, to eventually impose a wealth tax on those holdings. Capital gains tax only applies when profit is realized. But for houses and real estate, we already pay holding taxes. You pay simply for owning the asset. That arguably contradicts the spirit of the Constitution. But in a democracy, if enough people demand it, even bad ideas can pass. Envy, resentment, a kind of sentiment can fuel demands like tax Bitcoin holdings. When people demand a holding tax on Bitcoin, the state can do it. I believe we'll see many countries go down that road. So if you pay close attention to the travel rule, to prepare for a holding tax, here's one approach. Buy Bitcoin before the travel rule kicks in and just move it off the exchange. But really, why are we stressing so much about the travel rule? Let's pause and look at some basic facts. How many Bitcoins are in circulation today? At the time of filming, about 19 million. Now, how many of those have ever passed through an exchange? Roughly 12 to 13 million, which means 5 to 7 million Bitcoins have never touched an exchange. Here's what's even more important. Exchanges don't have perfect historical records of past on-chain transactions. Unless all global exchanges simultaneously implement the travel rule, a large portion of Bitcoin will remain off the grid, never subject to exchange oversight. We're talking about millions of Bitcoins that never touched an exchange. Do you think those Bitcoins will voluntarily return to exchanges to become targets for wealth taxation? If you believe that, you don't truly understand or believe in Bitcoin's finality of settlement. Those who don't understand Bitcoin's finality of settlement, they usually say things like this. Well, eventually you'll have to put it into an exchange to cash it out, right? That's a textbook example of someone who doesn't believe in Bitcoin's finality. Finality of settlement means it is cash final. Once it's done, it's irreversible. If you feel like you must convert it to Korean won or to dollars someday, it means you're not an actual user of Bitcoin. You're in a developed country like Korea, and you're simply holding Bitcoin as a speculative investment. Bitcoin wasn't created to satisfy people hoping for price appreciation. That was never its founding purpose. Its rising price reflects low adoption and a lack of mainstream conviction, that's all. That gap is what creates a rare opportunity. Now, not later. Ultimately, what Bitcoin aims for is a trust network combined with tools like the Lightning Network, enabling global final settlement level payment across borders. In that world, exchanges are no longer the final destination. Some of you might struggle to imagine it. Who would accept a volatile asset like Bitcoin in exchange for goods or services? But yes, that's exactly what will happen. You need to believe that future. That's the essence of final settlement. Let's say governments start preparing in a coordinated, methodical way to track Bitcoins on exchanges. Since everything tied to exchanges is traceable, including newly issued Bitcoins, their ownership will be fully visible and taxed. But when it comes to off-exchange Bitcoins, even if governments apply the travel rule, a significant amount of Bitcoin will still circulate outside the scope of wealth taxation. Because Bitcoin is final settlement in itself, it no longer needs to exit into KRW, JPY, or USD. In other words, some Bitcoin will never return to exchanges, ever. Governments might say, the moment you deposit, we're going to tax every Satoshi you're holding. The more they watch and wait, the less likely that Bitcoin ever returns to exchanges. Then is off-exchange Bitcoin useless? Not at all. It's far from useless. That's precisely why I keep emphasizing the metaverse. The explosion of digital assets within metaverse platforms should be recognized as a digital asset revolution, not just a Bitcoin one. Digital assets aren't just the shady tokens you might be imagining. It's far broader than that. Take NFTs, for example. They're part of a much bigger trend toward asset digitization. As more things become digitized assets, even game items can leave the game or platform and have transferable ownership. Even air mileage could exit the airline servers, becoming independently owned and traded, and in platforms where such ownership is exchanged. Bitcoin could become the native payment method. Even if that Bitcoin never went through an exchange, you could still buy Korean air miles with it, or purchase a rare game item. Bitcoin can be used directly, in exchange for real-world digital services or goods. Because this kind of transaction can operate outside the government's attempt to impose a wealth tax, it exists independently of surveillance at centralized exchanges. Whether governments try to trace it, that's a whole different issue. The problem is governments today are underestimating how complex it really is. They assume that just monitoring exchanges will eventually allow them to tax all Bitcoin holdings. Only a state could even entertain such a forceful and sweeping idea. And yes, states do hold that power. That's what a state does. But that's exactly why Bitcoin was invented, with such states in mind. So contrary to popular fear. Bitcoin holders are not fish-trapped in a regulatory net waiting to be taxed at will. Bitcoin is designed to win a game played against governments that can change the rules at any time. If you don't grasp that, you panic every time a new rule, like the travel rule, is announced. Isn't that the mindset you're stuck in? That's my honest take. The Financial Action Task Force recommended the travel rule. They're an organization rooted in traditional anti-money laundering frameworks. The FATF clearly seems confused, and they lack a true grasp of Bitcoin and its surrounding ecosystem. They can barely keep up with the past, let alone comprehend the future that's already unfolding. That's my honest view. To regulate something properly, you have to define concepts precisely. You need clear boundaries, clear boxes. They're the type who will wait until things become legible before acting. In a market that changes by the second, I honestly don't understand what they think they're understanding. So, the reason many of you are anxious about the travel rule is because you don't really believe in Bitcoin's finality of settlement. You also lack understanding of the ecosystem that's been built over time, and of the very reason Bitcoin was invented. The reason people cheered for Bitcoin, that is that although governments can change the rules anytime they want, Bitcoin is a tool to resist that power. That's why it was created in the first place, so that in some essential respects, no state can ultimately control it. If you don't fully understand that, you won't understand why people celebrated it. No matter how much I explain the travel rule, you may still feel insecure about it because deep down, you haven't yet believed in Bitcoin. Governments can do anything. I have no idea what kind of ugly or intrusive measures they may come up with. Frankly, I don't think even the FATF really understands how this system works. Even if they do understand it, regulation inherently demands precise definitions. But they're already failing at that first step. Because crypto defies traditional categories and definitions, regulation just doesn't work well in this space. A wealth tax likely won't work. At the very least, it won't be fairly implemented, that's my take. But governments are actively researching this, and we don't know exactly how this will evolve. So I want to be cautious in what I say. Although this video is about the Lightning Network and the travel rule, I've added many other things to help you understand.